Hi guys, welcome to another Rossi audio video. Today we're going to talk about top 10 most underrated, maybe overlooked vintage speakers. I'm not talking about the new stuff that has been made for the last 20 years, um, but if you go 20 plus years back in time, top 10 speakers that I think and feel is kind of overlooked and kind of underrated. So let's just jump straight into it. These are in just random orders. There's no like number one is more overlooked than number 10 or something like that, but these are equally overlooked and maybe passed by and underrated. So the first brand of speakers that we have is Fraser. They made some really nice speakers back in the day. They're no longer in business. But when they were in business, they made some really cool speakers and they made some really good sounding speakers. And I find it weird that they don't get more attention than what they do. However, on the other hand, Fraser can be very, very hard to find. There is not a lot of those speakers floating around for sale. So that is maybe one part of it, but still, I don't think they get the talk and the attention and are not being mentioned a lot in different social media groups. And they really should because they had some really killer models. Number two is a brand that gets a little bit more attention and people talk a little bit more about them, and that is Bose. Bose also made some really, really cool and really good speakers back in the 70s, and I mean before that, and it was they rivaled a lot of the bigger brands, and I still feel that in today's market, they kind of suffer the same thing as Fraser. A lot of people are overlooking them, and there is not a lot of attention focused directed to them. But they had some really good killer speakers in the day, and you can see Bose for sale maybe a little bit more than you can see Fraser speakers. So that's a more positive thing about Bose, that there's maybe a little bit better possibility of getting your hands on a pair. Now the third brand is they're still in business, but they have gone through some really weird ownership changes over the last 30 years, 35 years. And they're not the same company as they used to be. And we're, of course, talking about Wharfdale. And some of the old Wharfdale stuff is amazing. But I still feel that they suffer kind of a little bit because of what the models that was released in the later days, in the later years. So people are kind of like thinking that, okay, Wharfdale from the 80s and 90s and 2000s are the same as the 60s and 70s and even 50s. And that's not true. Before Wharfdale was sold to holding companies and marketing companies, and it was put on licenses. Wharfdale was one company that made some really good speakers, and the older speakers are somewhat collectible, and some people maybe know more about it, and you can see it a little bit more than Bose and Fraser, but still it's being overlooked and passed by many just because of they don't know how good the older Wharfdale is. The problem is that the older Wharfdale are normally owned by people who knows this, and if they're gonna sell it, they know how to charge accordingly. So they're kind of like a little bit more expensive than the previous two band that I mentioned. But I mean, I wouldn't pay too much for any Wharfdale speaker from the 90s or even 80s. However, Wharfdale changed again in the somewhere in the 2000s, and they have become a little bit better. But today they're mainly a pro audio manufacturer. Number four is Coral, and they can be had more than the first three ones that I mentioned. You can see Coral speakers for sale more than the other three, and some people know about them and some people talk about them, but still not in the masses as it should be, because Coral made some okay and good speakers, but they also made a couple that was really, really good. Maybe not in the same category as Fraser, Bose, and Wharfdale, but still, you can get Coral today for a very good bargain. So people who pass up Coral should really stop and think about it, because they have some good models. Number 5 on the list people will probably disagree with me on. And when I say Cerwin-Vega, because a lot of people will say, well, there's a lot of Cerwin-Vega talk in the groups, and a lot of people have them, and people post things for sale and stuff like that, and there's a lot of models for sale online. Yes, those are what I call the more mainstream models that was made in the 80s and 90s and 2000s. People are totally in the dark when it comes to the more vintage Cerwin-Vega, such as the 60s and 70s models, which was called HED, High Energy Design. Those are some of the better models that Cerwin-Vega made when it comes to sound quality. Maybe not in bass and all that stuff, but and loudness and how loud they can play. But the 70s Cerwin-Vega is often overlooked because of what happened in the 80s and 90s and now. So people tend to pass by because they think, oh, it's just another Cerwin-Vega with a typical Cerwin-Vega sound and a party speaker. Well, wrong. The HED line was way more than just a boomy, loud speaker. They made some really cool models. They made some of them are rare, and some of them are super rare, and some you can only see pictures of and you can't find them. And of course, you have the 50s models from Cerwin-Vega, the ones that was made in the 1950s, which is almost impossible to find, where only a handful of people have heard them in these days. I've been so lucky. And there are some other better models that you can get. So people kind of tend to pass up on the older Cerwin-Vega just because, okay, in the 80s and the 90s, they made some big box speakers that play loud and they have a lot of bass. Well, let me tell you, the HED line, the high energy design, is way different. Yes, they are efficient, they can play loud too, but first of all, they were made for the scene and the hi-fi scene and the stereo scene that was roaming around in the 70s, which had nothing to do with high power and loud music. It was more musicality and a totality of sound. So 1970s Cerwin-Vega, 1960s, they had a few models in the late 60s, but not many. And of course the ones that were made in the 50s. These tend to be passed up and overlooked and very underrated. Now, number 6 on the list is probably, people will say, no, I don't agree with that. And that's Electro Voice. They are of course known for making their pro audio systems and speakers. But back in the day, Electro Voice had some really cool, nice looking hi-fi speakers. And they were innovative. And they were some of the betters that you could get. They sounded really good, and they really rivaled both JBL and Tannoy and many other brands when it came to sound, and especially sound per dollar, because the prices were really good. So if you overlook and pass by some older Electro Voice speakers, you're doing yourself a disfavor, because they had some really cool, really good models back in the day. They stopped making hi-fi products at some point, and they really just went straight out pro. But back in the day, you can get some big, nice, huge speakers from Electro Voice for hi-fi use. Number 7 is Technics. And yes, I know that Technics had a lot of speakers that came with these all-in-one rack, or the rack systems that were sold in the 80s. But Technics has another line of speakers too that is very often overlooked by the masses. Only a few that really knows about them and know what they are and are into them really only give them attention and pay some tribute to those. I sold a pair of the SB7000 a month and a half ago, and that line of speakers are very often overlooked by many, by the masses. Of course, you have a few collectors and a few people that are interested in them, that knows all about them and knows how good they are. So Technics had a lot of speakers that was standalone. You bought them alone, and they had nothing to do with racks or components or all-in-one boxes or something like that. Even though that has been a big part of Technics' business philosophy for many years. So Technics had some really good speakers back in the day that is overlooked and passed by. Number 8, and this is the here now we're starting to talk about some of the holy grails of sound back in the day, and we're talking about Jensen. Jensen suffered the same thing as Wharfedale did. Jensen was really good in the 40s, 50s, and 60s. They made some killer stuff, and some of those drivers today can fetch huge prices on eBay. Some of the tweeters they had back in the 50s can today go for like $1,000 each, and they're considered to be some of the best sounding tweeters out there. And the same with some of the mid-ranges and woofers. And of course they had some really good speakers that they made themselves too, because Jensen kind of have had a love-hate relationship with the business, because they made their own products, but they also made drivers for others that other people used and other companies used. 1950 Cerwin-Vega used Jensen tweeters, just to show you how. So when people think of Jensen, they kind of think of Jensen from the 80s, 90s, which is not Jensen that you had back in the 40s, 50s, and 60s. Around 1974, things started to go a little bit downhill for Jensen, and at a little bit later point they got bought out, and new ownerships, and Jensen then became kind of like a holding company where they had their own brand Jensen. They bought up Face Linear, they had some Face Linear car audio stuff, they bought up Advent, and they had a lot of stuff in that holding company thing, and that kind of tend to go downhill and sour on quality on components and speakers and whatever you make. So 1940s, 50s, 60s Jensen and early 70s Jensen, you can find some killer speakers that are really, I want to say, some of the holy grails that you can find, and very highly regarded by many when it comes to sound. Number 9, KLH. Henry Claus did it many times. He did Advent, he did the KLH and some other things. And the reason I put KLH on this list is because a lot of people know about Henry Claus, they know what he did, but they kind of tend to go towards their Advent speakers that he made. And he only made Advent for a short period of time. He was only involved with Advent for a short period of time compared to his legacy and his run in the business. KLH is, I want to say, the great duckling and the half sister and the stepsister to Advent speakers, and they deserve a lot more attention, because I want to say that some of the KLH models sounds better than the Advent models, like the OLA that I have here. They sound good, but they lack a lot too, and they're not high end. KLH is in the same boat. They're not high end or by any means, but they sound good, and they had some configurations on their speakers that Advent didn't have. I like the ways KLH made some 3-ways with 12-inch woofers and stuff, because I feel that some of the Advent speakers lacks a little bit in the bottom end, where KLH is a little bit more complete, a little bit more dynamic, and a little bit sprucier and a little bit more happier, and if you know what I mean. So I think that KLH is suffering because of people being too much hung up on Advent. So that's why I put KLH on my list. Now number 10 is the last one, and the same thing here. There was a time where they made some really good speakers, and then things changed, ownerships and all that stuff. Time came along, and they made up some more speakers, but it wasn't the same. I went to, of course, talking about Marantz. Marantz had a few models back in the day that was really freaking good. And things happens. Marantz got sold. Philips got involved at one point, and things started to go down really fast. And not only with amps and tuners and receivers and all that stuff, but also on the speaker side. So Marantz, if you can find the good Marantz speakers, those are very often forgotten by the masses and overlooked by the masses. People kind of like, well, the Marantz from the 80s and 90s is not that great. You're right. Marantz under Philips was at best. So, but if you go back and look up some of the HD models from Marantz and the really good stuff from the early days, you can find some killer speakers. And they have a very good balanced sound and a very good bottom end as well. So they can rival a lot of brands. When that is said, I'm going to do a couple of honorable mentions, and that's EPI and Ohm. But people are talking about those a little bit more, and they're a little bit easier to find online for sale. So they didn't make it to the list, but they are also by the masses kind of like overlooked. But then again, you have a little bit bigger group of people talking about EPI and Ohm. So that's two brands that maybe 20 years from now will fit this list, because I mean, generations of people come and go, and we don't know how the younger generation is fitting in this vintage audio group of people. So there we have it. And just to recap it, we have Fraser, Bose, Wharfdale, Coral, Cerwin-Vega, Electro Voice, Technics, Jensen, KLH, and Marantz. Those are the top 10 speakers that I think and feel, and it looks to me, is being overlooked and kind of like forgotten in the big pictures of vintage audio. So if you're looking for speakers, if you're into the market to buy a pair of speakers, look up and try and find some of these brands. And if I was going to recommend you something, I really would recommend you to look for some of the older. It all depends on your budget as well here, of course. Some of these are more expensive than others, like Electro Voice, Jensen, Marantz, are probably the more expensive ones on this list if you're gonna try and find them. But if you are on a budget, and there's the thing, and Bose can be high too, but if you are on a budget, there, I would say Coral, Technics, KLH is probably the more affordable ones. Fraser, Bose, Wharfdale, Cerwin-Vega is in the middle road, and Electro Voice, Jensen, and Marantz are, and Electro Voice is in the higher price range. So I hope this helped you. There are of course other brands, but the brands that I put on the list at least meets the criteria of some degree of quality, of sound and build quality, but also how they have been influencing the market over the last 50, 60, 70 years. So there's of course, a lot of brands and a lot of speakers that was in business that popped up in maybe the 60s and 70s or even 80s and then disappeared again. But these are the brands that I can feel comfortable with recommending, because that's also what this is about. These are the top 10 forgotten, overlooked brands, speakers that I can recommend that you look into. And of course, they're competing against other brands like Tannoy, JBL, and other bigger brands that sold more. But these 10 are a really, really good alternative. So with that, take care and have a nice day.